The laughter started before Jacob could even take 3 steps into the reception hall. "Wait a second," Vanessa said loudly, pointing toward him. Did somebody seriously invite him? Several heads turned. Jacob stopped. The room was filled with expensive suits, designer dresses, and people who looked like they had never worried about a bill in their lives. And then there was him. His suit was clean but old. The fabric had faded slightly with time. His shoes showed signs of wear. Vanessa covered her mouth dramatically. "Oh my goodness. This is a $30,000 wedding, not a charity event." The guests around her burst into laughter. Jacob felt every eye in the room settle on him. For a moment, nobody spoke. Then Vanessa took a sip of champagne and smiled. "Tell me I'm not the only one wondering who let the farm boy in." More laughter followed. Jacob could have turned around. He could have left. Instead, he simply looked at her and said calmly, "I'm exactly where I'm supposed to be." The smile on Vanessa's face faded slightly. She had expected embarrassment. She had expected anger. She certainly hadn't expected confidence. If you're enjoying the story so far, don't forget to like the video, subscribe to the channel, and let us know in the comments. Have you ever been judged by your appearance? Vanessa rolled her eyes. "Well, somebody's confident." Jacob nodded politely and continued walking. That irritated her more than any argument could have. The wedding coordinator suddenly approached him. "Jacob." A smile spread across her face. "We're so glad you made it." Jacob shook her hand. "Thank you." Vanessa's eyebrows lifted. The coordinator knew him? That didn't make sense. Jacob was soon led toward a reserved table near the front. Several guests noticed. Whispers spread immediately. "Why is he sitting there? That's close to the groom's family. Who is this guy?" Vanessa watched him carefully. Something felt wrong. People like Jacob didn't belong at weddings like this. At least that's what she believed. A few minutes later, the groom entered the reception area. Applause erupted. The guests stood. Vanessa smiled proudly as cameras flashed throughout the room. The groom greeted family members before suddenly looking across the hall. His face brightened. "Jacob." Before anyone could react, he walked directly toward him. The room became strangely quiet. The groom wrapped him in a hug. A genuine hug. Not the kind people gave out of politeness. The kind reserved for someone important. "Brother, you made it." Jacob smiled. "I wouldn't miss it." The groom laughed. "I was worried you'd stay on the farm." Vanessa's eyes widened. The farm? So he really was a farmer. Yet the groom was treating him like family. Nothing about this situation made sense. After speaking for several minutes, the groom returned to his guests. The whispers immediately resumed. Vanessa wasn't finished. She grabbed 2 of her friends and walked toward Jacob's table. "Mind if we join you?" Jacob nodded. "Of course." The women sat down. Vanessa looked him up and down. "So, you're a farmer?" "I work on a farm." The women exchanged amused glances. Vanessa smiled. "I knew it." Jacob remained silent. "You know," she continued, "most people would dress a little better for an event like this." One of her friends laughed. "I was thinking the same thing." Jacob looked at his suit. "It gets the job done." Vanessa shook her head. "That might be the saddest thing I've heard all week." The women laughed again. Still, Jacob didn't react. No anger, no embarrassment, no attempt to defend himself. And somehow, that made Vanessa even more determined to get under his skin. The evening continued. Dinner was served. Music played. Guests mingled. Yet Vanessa kept finding ways to return to Jacob. Every time she saw him speaking to someone, she interrupted. Every time she heard someone compliment him, she inserted a joke. "Careful," she told one guest. "He might charge you in potatoes." The table exploded with laughter. Jacob simply smiled politely. Later, another guest sat beside him. "So how do you know the groom?" Before Jacob could answer, Vanessa jumped in. "Probably sold him vegetables." The group laughed again. Jacob finally spoke. "We met years ago." "Doing what?" Vanessa asked. "Working." "On a farm?" "Yes." Vanessa leaned back dramatically. "Well, there you have it." More laughter. Yet the guest who had asked the question noticed something strange. Jacob didn't seem bothered. In fact, he looked completely relaxed, almost like he knew something everyone else didn't. As the night continued, Vanessa became obsessed with figuring him out. Why wasn't he embarrassed? Why wasn't he leaving? Why did he seem so calm? Then she noticed something else. Every few minutes, Jacob checked his watch. Not nervously, patiently, as if he were waiting for someone. Vanessa followed his gaze toward the entrance. Nobody was there. A few minutes later, he checked again. Then again. Then again. Her curiosity grew. Who exactly was this guy waiting for? And why did he seem so certain that whoever it was would eventually arrive? She had no idea that before the night was over, the answer would leave every guest in that room speechless. Vanessa couldn't stop thinking about Jacob. The more she watched him, the more irritated she became. People who were embarrassed usually looked embarrassed. People who didn't belong usually tried to hide. Jacob did neither. He sat comfortably, spoke politely, and carried himself with a quiet confidence that made absolutely no sense. Vanessa decided she was done being subtle. If she wanted answers, she would force them out of him. She stood and tapped a glass with a spoon. The room gradually quieted. "Since we're all having such a wonderful evening," she said with a smile, "why don't we get to know each other a little better?" Several guests nodded. Vanessa pointed toward a businessman. "What do you do?" The man answered. Applause followed. She pointed toward another guest. The woman described her successful company. More applause. Then Vanessa turned toward Jacob. A slow smile spread across her face. "And what about you?" The room became quiet. Jacob looked up. "I work on a farm." A few chuckles immediately appeared around the room. Vanessa wasn't satisfied. "What exactly do you do there?" "I help manage the land." "Manage the land?" she repeated dramatically. "So you're basically a farmhand." Laughter echoed across the room. Jacob nodded. "If that's how you'd like to describe it." The laughter grew louder. Vanessa raised a glass. "Well, ladies and gentlemen, I think we found the hardest working man at the wedding." More laughter. Jacob remained calm. That calmness was beginning to drive her crazy. If you're enjoying this story, take a second to like the video and subscribe. The ending of this story changes everything. Vanessa sat down again. One of her friends leaned closer. "Why doesn't he react?" "I don't know," Vanessa whispered, "but I'm going to find out." A little later, guests moved toward the dance floor. Jacob stayed near his table. The groom eventually returned and sat beside him. The two men began talking. They laughed together like old friends. Vanessa watched from across the room. Jealousy started creeping into her thoughts. Why did the groom seem to respect him so much? She quietly moved closer, close enough to overhear. "I still owe you for that," the groom was saying. Jacob shook his head. "You don't owe me anything." "I absolutely do." "No, you changed my life." Vanessa's eyes narrowed. "Changed his life? How?" The groom lowered his voice, making the rest impossible to hear. A few moments later he stood and returned to greeting guests. Vanessa immediately approached Jacob. What was that about? Jacob looked confused. "What?" "The groom said you changed his life." Jacob smiled slightly. "That's between us." Vanessa crossed her arms. "Oh, come on." Jacob simply shook his head. "I'm sorry." Then he looked at his watch again. Vanessa noticed. There it was. Again. The watch. The waiting. The confidence. Something wasn't adding up. Unfortunately, Vanessa wasn't the type of person who walked away from a mystery. She was the type who created problems. Within an hour, rumors started spreading through the reception. The source was always the same. Vanessa. He's probably exaggerating his friendship with the groom. Maybe he's looking for investors. I heard he's asking people about money. None of it was true, but rumors move faster than facts. Guests who had been friendly toward Jacob started keeping their distance. Conversations became shorter. Smiles became forced. Jacob noticed. Of course he noticed, but he still refused to defend himself. That only encouraged Vanessa further. By now she had convinced herself she was exposing a fraud. Then came dinner. The guests gathered around beautifully decorated tables. Vanessa ended up seated directly across from Jacob. The opportunity was too perfect. She smiled sweetly. "Jacob, can I ask you something?" "Sure." "What's the most expensive thing you've ever owned?" Several guests looked up. Jacob paused, then smiled. "I've never really thought about it." Vanessa laughed. "Come on." "I haven't." "You must have something." Jacob shrugged. "Not really." The table erupted with laughter. Vanessa looked around proudly. "You see? That's what happens when someone spends their whole life on a farm." Jacob took a sip of water. No reaction. No anger. Nothing. One guest finally spoke. "Why are you being so hard on him?" Vanessa smiled. "I'm not. We're just having fun." Jacob answered before anyone else could. "It's okay." The guest looked unconvinced. But Jacob genuinely seemed unbothered. That should have ended things. It didn't, because Vanessa had become determined to break him. A short time later, guests gathered near the dessert table. Jacob stood speaking with an older couple. Vanessa approached holding a glass of red wine. Several people noticed. Something about her smile looked dangerous. She stopped beside Jacob. "Oh, sorry." The words came a split second before she stumbled forward. The glass tipped. Red wine splashed directly across Jacob's jacket. The room gasped. Nobody believed it was an accident, not even Vanessa's friends. Jacob looked down. The stain spread across the front of his suit. Silence filled the room. Everyone waited. Finally, surely now he would react. Surely now he would lose his temper. Jacob simply grabbed a napkin. "It's all right." Vanessa blinked. "What?" "It's all right. You don't seem upset." He gently wiped the jacket. "It's only a suit." Those 4 words somehow embarrassed Vanessa more than if he had screamed, because she suddenly realized something. He genuinely didn't care. The expensive wedding, the wealthy guests, the designer clothes, none of it seemed important to him. For some reason, that made her furious. The rest of the evening became even worse. Vanessa quietly approached several members of the wedding staff. Then she found one of the security guards. She pointed toward Jacob. The guard listened, looked toward Jacob, then nodded. A few minutes later, Jacob noticed security watching him. Guests noticed too. Whispers immediately started. "What's going on? Did he do something? Is there a problem?" Vanessa stood nearby pretending innocence. Inside, she felt victorious. At last, people were questioning him. At last, his confidence seemed challenged. But even now Jacob remained calm. He checked his watch again, and looked toward the entrance. And for the first time all night, a small smile appeared on his face. Vanessa followed his gaze. The smile made her stomach tighten, because it looked like the smile of a man who knew something everyone else didn't. And outside the wedding venue, several black luxury vehicles had just pulled into the parking lot. The black vehicles rolled to a stop one after another. Inside the reception hall, most guests hadn't noticed yet, but the wedding coordinator had. The moment she glanced through the glass doors, her eyes widened. She hurried across the room so fast that several guests turned to watch her. A member of the venue staff rushed past moments later. Then another. The sudden activity immediately caught everyone's attention. "What is going on?" someone whispered. Vanessa looked around in confusion. Even the security guards seemed alert now. Then the groom noticed. His face changed instantly. Without saying a word, he stood up and headed toward the entrance. The bride followed. Several members of both families followed behind them. The room buzzed with curiosity. Meanwhile, Jacob remained seated, calm, relaxed, almost as if he had been expecting this exact moment all evening. Vanessa folded her arms. For the first time that night, uncertainty began creeping into her mind. The large doors opened. The conversation inside the room died immediately. A distinguished older man stepped inside. His silver hair was neatly combed back. His posture radiated authority. Several guests recognized him instantly. Murmurs spread across the room. "Oh my God! That's him! There's no way!" Vanessa's eyes widened. Even she knew who he was. One of the most successful businessmen in the state. A man whose companies employed thousands of people. A man whose name regularly appeared in business magazines. a man wealthy enough to buy entire blocks of property without blinking. The groom hurried forward. "Sir, we're honored you're here." The businessman shook his hand politely, but his attention seemed focused elsewhere. His eyes moved through the crowd, searching, looking. Then he found who he was looking for. Jacob. The businessman immediately started walking. Not toward the bride, not toward the groom, not toward the families, toward Jacob. The room became completely silent. Every step seemed to echo. Vanessa felt her heartbeat quicken. Something wasn't right. The businessman reached Jacob's table. Jacob stood. A smile appeared on both their faces. Then the older man spoke words that shattered the room. "Sorry I'm late, son." Silence. Absolute silence. Several guests literally froze. One woman nearly dropped her drink. A man at the next table choked on his water. Vanessa felt the color drain from her face. "Son? No, that couldn't be possible." Jacob smiled. "I figured you'd make an entrance." The businessman laughed. "You know me too well." Then he pulled Jacob into a hug. A genuine father's hug. The kind that cannot be faked. The room exploded into whispers. Did he say son? That's his son. Jacob is his son. Vanessa couldn't move. Every insult, every joke, every humiliating comment she had made replayed inside her head. Jacob was not some random farm worker. Jacob was the son of one of the richest men in the region. The businessman looked at the wine stain on Jacob's jacket. His expression changed. What happened there? Before Jacob could answer, several guests looked directly at Vanessa. The silence became uncomfortable. Very uncomfortable. Jacob smiled. Nothing important. The businessman studied his son for a moment. Then he nodded. He already understood. The groom approached. Jacob never told us. Jacob shrugged. It wasn't important. The businessman laughed. That's exactly why I'm proud of him. The room listened carefully. The businessman turned toward the guests. My son has spent the last 5 years living independently. Confused expressions appeared everywhere. The businessman continued. I offered him every luxury imaginable. He looked at Jacob. He turned them all down. Guests stayed in disbelief. He wanted to build his own character. He wanted to understand hard work. He wanted to earn respect instead of inheriting it. The room grew even quieter. The businessman smiled proudly, so he chose to work on farms. Several jaws literally dropped. Vanessa felt sick. Everything she had mocked was true. Jacob really did work on a farm. Not because he was poor, because he chose to. The businessman continued. Most people spend their lives trying to look wealthy. He placed a hand on Jacob's shoulder. My son spent his life trying to become valuable. The room erupted into applause. Guests who had ignored Jacob all evening suddenly looked ashamed. Others avoided eye contact entirely. Then came the final blow. The businessman glanced around the venue. This is a beautiful property. The groom smiled. Thank you. The businessman nodded. My company originally developed this land. The room gasped again. Vanessa closed her eyes briefly. Every new revelation seemed worse than the one before it. She remembered mocking his suit, mocking his job, mocking his background, spilling wine on him, spreading rumors, even speaking to security. And through all of it, Jacob had never once tried to embarrass her. Not once. If you're still watching, comment below, what would you have done in Jacob's situation? And don't forget to subscribe for more powerful stories like this one. A few minutes later, Vanessa slowly walked toward Jacob. The room seemed to notice immediately. Conversations faded. Everyone wanted to hear what would happen. Vanessa stopped in front of him. For the first time all evening, she had no clever remark, no joke, no confidence, only regret. I'm sorry. Jacob looked at her quietly. She swallowed hard. I judged you. Her voice trembled. I judged your clothes. I judged your job. I judged who I thought you were. Tears filled her eyes. And I was wrong. The room remained silent. Jacob could have humiliated her. Nobody would have blamed him. He could have listed every cruel thing she had done. He could have embarrassed her in front of every guest. Instead, he simply nodded. It happens. Vanessa looked shocked. That's it. Jacob smiled. People reveal their character when they meet someone they think can't benefit them. The words hit harder than any insult. Several guests lowered their heads, because they realized he wasn't just talking about Vanessa. He was talking about all of them. The entire room had judged him. The entire room had assumed they knew his worth. Simply because of a suit. Simply because of a job. Simply because of appearances. Jacob glanced around the reception. Then he spoke one final time. The value of a person isn't found in their clothes, their car, or their bank account. The room listened carefully. It's found in how they treat people. Silence followed. Then applause erupted. Not polite applause. Real applause. The kind that comes when people know they've just learned something important. The groom shook Jacob's hand. The businessman smiled proudly. And Vanessa stood quietly, reflecting on the lesson she would never forget. Because she had spent an entire evening laughing at a man she believed was beneath her, only to discover that true worth was never something money could buy. And as the celebration continued around them, one truth became impossible to ignore. The richest person in the room had never been the man with the most money. It had been the man with the most character. If you enjoyed this story, don't forget to like the video, subscribe to the channel, and share this story with someone who needs a reminder that appearances can be deceiving. Because respect should never be based on what someone wears. It should be based on who they are.